This is the Kratom Science Journal Club with Dr. Jonathan Cachat, neuroscientist and expert in psychopharmacology. In each episode, we discuss an article in a peer-reviewed journal. I'm your host, Brian Gallagher, blog and social media writer for KratomScience.com, your source for all things Kratom. Journal Club number 7, Kratom Use and Mental Health with Dr. Marc Swogger.
People who are pushing this narrative that Kratom's deadly, and if you take it, you're really risking your life, I think they're eliciting drug hysteria for other reasons.
Dr. Swogger is a clinical psychologist and substance use researcher at University of Rochester. One paper that our guest, Dr. Marc Swogger, worked on, Kratom Use and Mental Health, a systematic review. And this came out in Drug and Alcohol Dependence in 2018. Yeah, and we have one of the authors, Dr. Marc Swogger, on today. Welcome, Dr. Swogger.
Hey, thank you. Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be able to talk about this.
Yep.
Definitely. So, I'll just jump in here real quick. But so it looks like this was one of the potential first comprehensive lit reviews, right? And it was looking at January 1960 through July 2017.
Yeah.
That's right. Yep.
Yeah, that's right. We were just trying to find whatever we could at the time, which I guess we started writing it in 2017. Just wanted to see what was out there, essentially. We didn't find much, right? So at the time, there wasn't a whole lot available in human studies. There was certainly plenty available in the pharmacology literature for animal studies, and quite a bit was known about Kratom. How are we pronouncing it today? Because
they told me to pronounce it Kratom because everybody, the guys that run Kratom Science call it Kratom because they've been into it for a long time. And then I started making videos for YouTube. Here's how you make Kratom tea, and they said just pronounce it Kratom because we started to get comments like, "What's Kratom? What is that?"
Oh yeah.
So I mean. Yeah. I guess since I don't pronounce Paris, I'll just go with Kratom.
I mean, I suppose there's some value. I think that is true. I think in Malaysia, it's pronounced Kratom by a lot of people, but I'm so used to calling it Kratom that I guess I'll just do that for now until I learn a little better. We were just looking for whatever we could find in terms of observational studies in humans, and we found, I guess it was roughly 15 studies, and then had to eliminate a couple due to the studies not really containing the information you need to be able to evaluate them, which is a big problem. I'd love if we could get into this a little bit. It's just the way the information has flowed.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I said in the beginning. I appreciated that you had called out drug hysteria because I think that a lot of people in this sort of controlled substance space recognize drug hysteria as, assuming the worst, banning and asking questions later.
Yeah.
So it was a review like this was necessary in order to sort of push back against, essentially what would be Kratom madness or reefer madness.
Right. I mean, it was happening all over again, just like it will the next time somebody discovers a plant that helps people.
Right. Right.
And I'm trying to you mentioning that makes me want to go back and look at Carl Hart's.
I had a note here to ask about Carl Hart because he's he's pretty good. I've read his book and I watched him on YouTube and stuff like that. Yeah. And he points out really that one of his statistics was something like 80% of people who try drugs don't become addicted to that drug, which is like a good point based on what everybody's perception of even people that have tried cocaine, most of them, and that's considered a hard drug that you get addicted to, didn't end up getting addicted to it. So it's really hysteria around it.
Yeah, it really does. And people in the field of drug treatment come with differing views, but a lot of that hysteria has leaked over into that field, and it's sad because it doesn't represent what the science is telling us. It's just this sort of emotional reaction to the idea that somebody's tried a drug and now it's going to destroy their lives inevitably.
Right. When it strangles the research. And, I've been in, mention the, addiction treatment and drug treatment centers. Like, it's hard in some ways to take, been in public testimony, and it's hard to take their opinions objectively because they're sort of in the business of, treating those types of people. And, maybe it's a pessimistic view, but it's also the same way with law enforcement. I mean, they get the most sort of civil asset forfeiture and funding to go after cannabis. If cannabis is legalized, then they're no longer have that revenue stream. So it's always, I think you always want to try to be as objective as you can. But this drug hysteria and just sort of banning and then asking questions later, it not only is bad in general for public, but it prohibits the science from proceeding. So we can't even really get into that.
It sets up so many barriers. And I mean, people think I will give people the benefit of the doubt, even though I know that some individuals, like Scott Gottlieb and people like that, are acting questionably or have acted questionably, knowing the science. I think a lot of people really believe that they are doing good by just banning first and asking questions later, and they don't see they don't see the bigger picture. And Kratom is a great example of that. So if you look at the work we did in 2018 kind of followed a paper we did in 2015, and it's just I have to say, there's nothing new in it, right? Like, so if we look through our 2018 paper, it was just this collation and systematic review of 13 quality studies from both the East and the West, looking at the consequences, good or bad, of Kratom use. Mm-hmm. And what we found was pretty much what everybody else has found. And you don't see that kind of replication in the literature often. Like, it's just been so consistent. Henningfield's group, there was that newer paper by Coe, I think was the first author, and Oliver Grundmann and Veltzi and Garcia, and everybody's finding the same things when they talk about Kratom use in people. And so what we found across these studies in very different populations was that people are using it for harm reduction purposes, getting off of opioids and dealing with the withdrawal of classical opioids, and improving mood and anxiety symptoms, post-traumatic stress disorder, and treating their pain. And these are the things that have been found in every observational study, every survey that is, a valid and a higher quality piece of work.
The fact that the studies are from different, regions of the world and different sort of funded by different groups, done by different researchers, and the findings generally follow along the same path. Like I think it solidifies a little bit further that this is, at the very least, that humans are doing this because it provides some functional benefit to them. This is what they say it is. We need to go in more. Yeah.
And it's all like every time there's a new study, and we are sort of stuck at the level of either sort of basic science or observational studies until the clinical trials are done. But that's been an interesting point of contention, right? Because on one hand, the folks who are coming out and warning people about Kratom use are citing a lot of case studies and toxicology studies that have all of these limitations. And on the other hand, they're saying we won't know until we get clinical trials. And there's a little bit of truth to that. Like, if there are long-term and significant rare health risks of this plant for humans or certain people based on pre-existing conditions or genetic makeup or whatever, we won't know until those come out. But that doesn't mean we know nothing.
Right.
And it also doesn't mean that, case studies where you pick somebody with liver damage and check to see whether they've used Kratom and then publish it, doesn't mean that those tell the story either. So it's
right.
Yeah.
Exception isn't the rule.
Right. And there are reasons why these studies are published. Like, very well, like, first of all, people have to publish to advance their careers. And Kratom's not hard to publish on because it's a topic of interest for a lot of journals. Like the case studies that are often pulled together and cited as reason for concern, it's not like they're not, they don't matter at all. But you could make the case that, I don't know, gummy bears cause liver damage if you wanted.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or milk. They all had milk in the refrigerator.
I think there was a black licorice instance a couple of weeks ago where a guy just ate nothing but black licorice for 3 weeks and died.
Jeez Louise.
Yeah, that was pretty
Wild
crazy.
Time.
Wow, that was a party. But
he got it for
bad.
the kids
Jesus.
for Halloween, I guess. And I have a couple of questions that relate back to the drug hysteria. Now, you looked at studies that go all the way back to the 60s, I think.
Our search criteria did that, but I'm not sure what the earliest one was. I don't think it was.
Okay. Yeah, the earliest I noticed in the references was 95. Was that because they got redundant, like the older you got?
There's one really highly cited one from like 75. I don't want to say the name of the researcher. I mean, it was an early study on Kratom use in humans in Thailand. And it's very highly cited just because there's so little available. But if you look at the study, they don't really say what they did. And then they draw conclusions about harm that are much more correlational than anything else. And they had chosen a group of heavy drug users. So you can't glean that much information from it. We had to drop 2 studies like that, I think.
So was the sort of drug hysteria already there in those early studies, or did that come along maybe like after the Nixon administration, the drug war started, or had it already been there? Because, I mean, the reefer madness goes all the way back to the 30s.
Yeah, it's hard to say because there's so many reasons for oppressing a group that uses plants or drugs for I was just reading something today about the Spanish Inquisition and how people who used magic mushrooms or psilocybin were killed for that practice.
Oh, wow.
So it's always been a thing. I'm not sure that those studies were impacted so much by drug hysteria. I guess I wouldn't know, but they certainly drew conclusions that were not supported by the data they had.
And there's always like some element of tribalism, like in group versus out group. People favor their historical drug of choice while they don't appreciate it, an out group. It's almost, something unavoidable with humans. Yeah.
I mean, how many people are sitting around drinking whiskey and calling Kratom dangerous as hell? I mean, it's, that's always a part of it, isn't it?
Yeah, and I did this webinar today. It was like the American Academy of Addiction Psychiatry. I had no business being on it, but it was really, they were talking about Kratom, so I just listened in. And basically, it was like the questions were, how soon do I introduce buprenorphine as a treatment for Kratom addiction? So, I mean, I guess, like even vice versa, people use Kratom to get off opiates, but and it was psychiatry, so I guess they use medicine to treat things more than maybe like psychology. For addiction in general, would like a social scientist or a clinical psychologist try to look into like behaviors or past trauma, like more so than buprenorphine?
I'm really glad you asked this question because there's so much confusion about who's who and who knows what, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm a clinical psychologist, and I'm studying this because I have an interest in substance use, harmful substance use, helpful substance use, whatever. And so, PhDs are trained in science. So we can look at the literature and we can conduct research. So MDs may or may not be trained in science. A lot of the time, MDs are trained enough to read some of the literature but don't know it well. Other MDs are scientists who do their own research. So it's really hard to tell who knows what. As a clinician, I can't really legally do much in the way of recommending Kratom. I can talk with people who are already considering it. I can bring it up to people and try to help them work through things. But so my science is very separate from my clinical work, except that they inform each other. Whereas MDs are always, they're trained in the prescribing the pharmaceuticals that are supported by the system, and that's not necessarily a good or bad thing in general. But it certainly means that when they hear Kratom, they'll be alarmed, and when they hear buprenorphine, they'll be excited. So doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, because I think they're very similar, and each has its benefits and negative consequences.
Section 3.1 of the paper. I'm going through sections where I wrote questions, but it talks about substitution. Some people would say you're just replacing one addiction with the other. This is kind of the same as the last question, really. But, I mean, is there something to that argument, since Kratom can be habit forming? We've seen a lot of people that have, wanted to get off of Kratom. And is there anything in any of these that show, maybe how many people have become addicted to Kratom that have tried it? Would it be like Carl Hart's percentage? Would it be like 10% or something like that? Or is there even anything to show that?
Boy, that's a really good question. I think we know more about the consequences of being dependent on Kratom than we do about the percentage of people who will become dependent on it. What we know is that Kratom dependence is for a small percentage of the population is a big deal. But if you look at the studies we've got now, they suggest that even people who are dependent on Kratom are functioning relatively well socially. They're maintaining their jobs. And they, and if they have to withdraw from it, it's relative to classical opioids. It's easy. Maybe that's not the right word to use, because those people who do have a really difficult time with it exist, but the withdrawal period is shorter. The symptoms are less severe. It's a relatively forgiving plant. So you're going to have risks and benefits with anything. And the benefit to risk profile is pretty good for Kratom relative to the classical opioids.
Yeah, and there was just a story about a U.S. Customs official who was stealing from people. He probably stole about $10,000 in a year or something like that. And his lawyer claimed that he was addicted to Kratom and he was feeding his addiction, which they didn't say anything about Kratom in the initial reports when he got arrested and they caught him stealing. But after a year, his lawyer is now saying, oh, he had this Kratom addiction. And, I mean, despite the fact that lots of U.S. Customs officers have been caught stealing from travelers, do you ever see a Kratom addiction that can be proven that actually has somebody acting like an opiate addict, like, maybe stealing and things like that? Or do you think that those people are just saying, I'm addicted to Kratom because one of the roadblocks with illegal drugs is people can't admit to the drug that they're hooked on?
Yeah, I work with a lot of people who are hooked on a lot of drugs, and I've never with Kratom, I've never seen that, and I've never seen evidence of it. I'm sure it could happen,
Yeah.
but it's so rare as to not exist in the scientific literature, to my knowledge.
Yeah.
So my guess about any given person would be that it's much more likely that they were going to steal anyway. But I guess you never know. I just don't see any evidence that kratom dependence operates like that.
Yeah.
You just don't see people stealing everything just to keep the withdrawal away. You see them going to bed for a few days.
Speaking of withdrawal, I thought one of the most interesting sort of sentences or takeaways that I had pulled out of this was towards the end in the discussion, when it was talking about data from North America indicating that higher education is associated with less incidents of withdrawal, but it was almost the opposite. I think in Malaysia, individuals with higher education had difficulty abstaining from kratom than less educated people. And I was just curious, is that something that jumped out at you guys? I had never seen a link between those two things before.
Yeah, that's a good question. I wasn't sure what to make of that. And I think it has less to do with the plant than it does with the circumstances of use. So it's really hard to say. People in Malaysia are using kratom under very different circumstances. Here, you're buying it on the internet, and it's relatively expensive for a lot of people. In a lot of cases, or getting it at smoke shops, and it's super hard to draw any causal conclusions, right?
And there was, some gender differences there as well, but those are generally, played out across addictive drugs, more or less. That there is some sort of dimorphism between the sexes.
Yeah. Good point. And also, up until more recently, most of the people who were studied in these studies are males.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I was going to ask why that is. Is it more of a traditional thing for men to drink kratom in say Malaysia?
I believe that is part of the culture. That I don't know. Men are more likely to be openly using a number of substances, I think, in the East. I think there's a bigger difference there.
And I think openly, too, is a key difference there, in that men probably feel more comfortable acknowledging or admitting in a public setting that they are doing that. That could be flushed out. Yep.
The cultural pressures are so much more powerful than the effects of the plant, I think, in some of these correlational data that we have. So it's really difficult to ascribe any result to particular effects of kratom.
Mood-related use, it said being age 41 or older, being married, having a bachelor's degree, and earning $75,000 or more. 4 out of 5 ain't bad for me. Were negatively associated with mood-related use. Is there any reason for that?
Men have, especially men who are being studied for substance use, have fewer mood problems than women. Men, in general, and this is a very general statement, but it does tend to operate throughout the literature on drug use. Men tend to use for reasons like stimulation, celebration, other things like that, whereas women will use more for mood-related problems. And that's not to say that men don't also use substances to alleviate mood problems. It's just that it's more common in women. And I think that just goes with women also having more problems with depression. The rates are higher in women. And anxiety, at least as reported anyway.
Right.
Women tend to report more depression and anxiety than men do, whereas a lot of men in, for instance, in substance use treatment, will report trying to alleviate boredom and also just sort of cultural factors. You're speaking with us from Pittsburgh, and I came from a steel town in Pennsylvania, and I know that back in the day, a lot of guys used to go to work and then after their shift would go go to the bar, straight to the bar.
Yeah.
And that was part of the culture. So I think things like that really play a big role in it. And it's hard to pull apart gender differences.
I was actually, when I was looking at this, I was thinking about my grandfather who went to the pub all the time. And, you know, my grandma stayed home and complained about him to my mom. But it was just like, I mean, my dad used to take me down there, and it was all old men. There weren't many old ladies in there. It's kind of that's kind of the kind of goes along the lines. And the same thing with, like, it used to be, you know, only a few decades ago, it was like stigmatized for women to smoke, and it's also said sedation has been reported by very low percentages. I don't know if that was in reference to a particular study, but I guess that might just be in general, because mostly people get energized with low amounts of kratom in general. I was going to ask if there's a difference between how people use it in the U.S. and in Asia, because I think it seems like people use more kratom here, like in powder form, rather than drinking as a tea.
Yeah, I think we've got sort of these. We got the powder, and then they've got the tinctures and the sort of higher alkaloid stuff here, because it started coming over in like 2000 it started or so, and whereas culturally, at least as from what I've read, it was chewed as leaves, or is chewed as leaves in Thailand and Malaysia, and so I think there's a higher chance of being sedated by these stronger concoctions that we have here, relative to the reported cultural use in Thailand.
I've never tried the chewed leaf approach. It just seems like even that, and thinking about with coca, like it just doesn't. And you know, I'm a tobacco user too, so I don't know. Maybe I just have already picked a plant I want to put in my lip, and just haven't tried it kratom yet.
It seems difficult, doesn't it? Like, well, I don't know how that would work really. But they do it.
Do you see lots of evidence of smoking or vaping? It does say that in the introduction.
No, very little. I know that it is possible to do. I've not tried it. I'd imagine it would be rough, but I haven't seen much evidence of it. And especially because it's so, like, anybody you talk to here who's using it is getting it through these highly processed ways, right? So we're getting like powder, and they're maybe making tea out of it, but a lot of people are just doing the toss and wash, where you just drink it down. And so I think that's leading to a lot of differences in the effects of it.
Yeah. Not a lot of terpenes in kratom that I'm aware of either, so it probably doesn't taste that great.
Oh, I doubt it.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of people report constipation, but I'm pretty convinced that that's a physical thing of actually swallowing wet powder and creating like cement in your stomach. Because I've only ever made tea out of it, and I've never had any of those types of issues.
I mean, in general, if you look at all the literature, just talking to people and what they've experienced, it really is just sort of it is a partial opioid agonist. So there may be some constipation, but it won't be like taking Percocet. And there may be some withdrawal, but it's not going to be like if you quit heroin. So it offers the potential for pain relief and other benefits. But you just don't see the level of side effects that you would get with classical opioids. You certainly don't see the respiratory depression, which may be why all of this politicization has gone on. This is a perfect substance to make into a pharmaceutical, and I think that's probably got a lot to do with why false narratives are being pushed.
Yeah, and then from the federal level now, battleground and state by state levels, and going down to the local level, like there's certainly some well capitalized motivation that's making all this happening, right? It's not just coming from the goodwill of good Samaritans out there, right? Really concerned about it. Yeah,
right. It's really odd, and I don't know what you think, but people who are pushing this narrative that kratom's deadly, and if you take it, you're really risking your life. Maybe there are some risks. Yeah, think about it. But I think they're eliciting drug hysteria for other reasons. It just doesn't make sense that they're doing it out of the goodness of their heart. I agree with you.
Yeah, and there's not piles of bodies stacking up.
Mm-hmm.
So. And I don't know if you got into this, but it's sort of back at the beginning in your search strategy, I thought that you guys had pulled together a really good set of search terms, using synonyms and going in a bunch of, you have amphetamines and also alcohol, tobacco, opiates. So I thought that was a really good set. And I was just curious, have you since ran these searches again, and then maybe there would be something to indicate why there's increased pressure for the legislation compared to what it was in 2017?
That's a really interesting point. We have not. I certainly have not. It's really tough to say. I mean, it seems obvious at some point that somebody could benefit from this being made into a pharmaceutical, and they want to eliminate competition. But I don't have any evidence of that. And maybe it would be interesting to run those search terms again. It's a good point.
So I had another question about withdrawal. It said the rate of withdrawal varies from 9% to 73%. Yeah. When we talk about withdrawal, is there a standard definition of that, or can it mean anything from I'm a little irritable to I'm having migraines and vomiting?
Well, I think both are true. So you can define it in a way that's reliable and valid. There's actually a kratom withdrawal scale, and I can't remember who the authors of that were. I think it was Sangam, and the severity can vary quite a bit. And it includes cravings and fatigue and insomnia and mood problems, right, and the nausea and physical sickness. But it depends. And so you get studies like these toxicology studies where they'll take people who called into a hotline and say, okay, well, you took kratom and you're reporting irritability, so that's right. That must be or you they'll do a study and it's like, oh, you stopped kratom 3 days ago and now you're irritable. But if you want to be more rigorous about it, you would pull together the symptoms that tend to cluster when you speak to people who have used a large amount and then quit, and you usually get the same types of things. So it's tough to say, and it does depend on dosing and where they are during the in the withdrawal course as well.
And there's got to be some element of culture playing into that as well, because you'll hear around the office all the time, oh, I'm withdrawing from my caffeine, or I can't get my work done until the caffeine's there, right? And so are we counting that as official withdrawal? Maybe they are irritable, but it's not you're not waking up in a puddle of sweat like you would maybe if you were cold turkey trying to quit heroin.
Totally. I mean, and so you bring up a couple good points there. How much is expectation? Mm-hmm. And sort of placebo.
And the placebo there is a real interesting one to me. I think it's almost in some ways it can be with cannabis like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So by drawing attention to the potential for withdrawal, are you actually inducing a more severe withdrawal?
Right.
It's certainly possible. So we got to be that. It's where I think elements of drug hysteria, particularly unchecked, can lead to more damage than perhaps the drug even itself.
Yes. Yeah, I totally agree with that, because people are looking for it, and so they're going to find it.
The issue of hallucinations was in here. Are there instances where kratom directly causes hallucinations, or is this in conjunction with like exhaustion or lack of sleep, or maybe multi-substance use?
So that's a really good question. Maybe we have more data on that than most of the things that I talk about. Hallucinations and delusions are something that were talked about early on in this politicization of kratom, and there's no evidence for it. Now, there are some interesting visual changes that would, I mean, in psychiatry, you would classify them as illusions, but they actually just make stuff look cooler, I guess. But a lot of the earlier studies on kratom were with people who are potentially psychotic to begin with and also using kratom. So there's no evidence that kratom causes hallucinations. Not that I would suggest that it can't. I would just say that, like, of all of the studies on human beings who take kratom, there's no good evidence that it does. And Darshan Singh has published on this. We published a paper a little while back that looked at psychosis in kratom users and just found nothing. Yeah. So I doubt it.
I find it interesting the effects that it can have, though, on your eyes and your visual way in a way that at least I've never experienced with, like a hydrocodone or an oxycodone, or heard people describe. But like, generally, if you take too much kratom, you get the wobbles, and your eyes in some ways like sort of lose focus in the periphery. And it's unlike anything, any other drug that I could really make an analogy to. And I don't know why. It's just interesting that happens.
It's very interesting. And I like the fact that you pointed out that it doesn't occur with classical opioids. And so that gives us an idea of the number of different things that are going on, maybe with serotonin or, other systems that haven't been explored particularly. Right. I've heard it. I've heard the kratom visual effects described as similar to psilocybin before it really kicks in. I thought that was interesting. And there's almost there is a certain amount of consciousness expansion associated with kratom. It's small, but it is notable. And a lot of people have pointed out that music sounds a bit better, or food tastes better, or visual effects are more interesting. So it certainly, I don't know much about the pharmacology, but it certainly indicates that things are going on that are not with classical opioids.
I think that that the acuity in hearing, and sort of like a higher sensitivity to hearing, or like a lower threshold, attention threshold, is similar across the board. But the eye thing, perplexes me, and I think it does draw attention to the fact that they are, somewhat same but different, and different in ways that are significant physiologically.
Yeah, it's a super, and there are a lot of things that are interesting about it. Most notably, its utility, like getting people off of opioids and maybe saving lives. But but things like this, things like a different sensory experience. That's fascinating stuff.
Case studies present a rather low level of evidence due to overrepresentation of extreme events. This is talking about case studies versus... Has there been, on the other hand, any studies with groups of people that showed a overall negative mental health outcome? Because I know that Darshan Singh study you mentioned, the couple of guys who had psychosis probably it wasn't a bigger percentage than would have anyway without the kratom. So has there been anything like in your review or anywhere else that showed that maybe like an overall negative mental health outcome?
I guess you could say that among people who begin using it and have a great deal of difficulty putting it down, and who go into withdrawal, they'll become irritable and angry and sad, and it'll have a disruptive mood effect if you get hooked on it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's worth noting. It's not it's not of no risk.
Yeah.
But other than a kratom use disorder, which I suppose is a thing that's possible, and we do see indications consistent with that. I haven't seen anything that would indicate that it's causing negative mental health effects just by being used here and there.
Because the thing I think about is a lot of people, they say that there's a term addictive personality, and I don't know how well that goes with the science, but is it that, a lot of people are already addicted to opioids, they switch to kratom, and they might develop a bad habit with kratom as well. Is it just something that they might have to address some other way, like maybe like childhood trauma or something like that they would have to address, and not necessarily dependent on whatever substance they're hooked on?
Absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head there. Kratom as a harm reduction tool is super useful, but you're assuming that people are maybe hooked on Percocet or heroin. And so then being hooked on kratom is a godsend, because people get their lives back and maybe don't die of an overdose. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, it doesn't deal with the underlying issue. If people with childhood trauma and other poverty and just some of the socioeconomic problems people have, it puts them at risk for trying to alter their mood in any way they can. And anybody who's in that situation could get dependent on kratom. It looks like it doesn't happen particularly easily. And it also looks like, for most people, and it also looks like when it does happen, it's not the end of the world. So, what are people replacing alcohol with? Because alcohol is pretty deadly if you get hooked, right? So,
and the variability there, even beyond the socioeconomic factors, variability in dopamine sensitivities or receptor profiles. There's just a number of, from multiple angles, a number of facets that can go into that. So people say, "Oh, I got the addiction gene from my dad." Oh, it's sort of like, well, you're conflating, probably 20 or 30 different variables that what's sort of like for could contribute to that. But, to say it's one thing is tough.
Some people just feel shitty, a lot of the time. I mean, that's really the science. You can write this down. The science is that some people feel shitty most of the time. And those people want to do a lot of different things to try to fix it. And some of those things are harmful. So, but so it is, I mean, just getting back to the original question. I mean, addressing that is the point. But I think that's where a lot of addiction counselors go wrong. They think that there's one way to deal with it. They think, well, you're going to be abstinent from it and you're going to get therapy to heal your trauma. And that's great, but it doesn't work for everybody. And so for those people who are not going to be abstinent and who are not going to get therapy, or who therapy doesn't work for, or medications don't work for, what's wrong with reducing the harm and increasing their likelihood of surviving?
Yeah. And this perfectly leads into my Marky Smith question.
I was wondering when that was coming.
I'm glad I waited till the end. If Marky Smith had discovered kratom instead of alcohol and speed, would he have written all that great music?
He would have used it once and gone back to the alcohol and speed.
Yeah,
that great music.
That's my answer too.
I think he's one of those people who felt miserable and did whatever he could to deal with it. And we're fortunate that he survived as long as he did.
He was so pleasant in all his interviews. Was he really miserable?
Didn't he try to put out a cigarette on one of the reporters? I think he did.
Probably. Yeah.
Mark, glad you could join us. A lot of fun talking to you.
Thanks, John. It was really good to be here. I apologize for the initial miscue there. Thanks a lot for a good discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Marc Swogger and Dr. Jonathan Cachat. The music is Captain Big Wheel. The song is called Moon Runner. The Kratom Science Podcast is written and produced by me, Brian Gallagher, for KratomScience.com. Like, subscribe, give us 5 stars, and take care.